Thanks. We're a smaller group, and I'm easygoing. I'm Canadian, so we can just you guys can just ask me questions and interrupt me or whatever as we go through this. This is like our high-level overview deck. You can jump into it if you want, not pay attention and send emails, or you can. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to talk to you guys about the history of PhoneGap and then get into where we're going. This is not me. This is David Matthews. But then somebody posted on the internet that it was me. So now I'm trying to debunk that every time I give a talk. I would not hang out at Vancouver Airport in a miniskirt eating pizza. It does kind of look like me, but it's not me.
The problem is, are these slides published without your vocal...
Right, yeah.
Like, oh,
so maybe it is me.
People look at it on the SlideShare and go, yep, that's him.
Yeah, so maybe I'm not helping my cause. Has anyone here actually built a PhoneGap app before I go into it too deep? Like 4 or 5 people? Okay, that's really cool. Remember when I used to do this, people would be like, what's PhoneGap? For fun, I'm going to go to my desktop. You guys see that? Cool. And in here I have like a fresh download. I have no idea what version of PhoneGap this is, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to use the CLI tools, by the way. I just do because it's faster. I've noticed this trend where front-end devs are starting to really start using their own tools, and I think it's awesome because it's way quicker. So when you download PhoneGap, you get a bunch of legalese, a changelog, our documentation, and a lib folder. And the lib folder is probably what you're actually interested in. If you jump into the iOS folder, you can take a look at it. There's a whole bunch of junk. None of it you will care about. But under the bin directory, there's a whole bunch of scripts. And if I look at those, you can see it does all this crazy stuff. The one I'm interested in is create. And so last year we realized that we had all these scripts for doing all this stuff, but it was different on every platform. And so you'd have a developer that was working on iOS, and then they'd switch context to Android, and they'd need to learn a whole bunch of new command line nomenclature. And so we unified that recently. So on my desktop, I'm going to create a project called foobar. I'll give it a package name, brian.io.foo, call it foobar. And that command just ran, and somewhere on my desktop there's a foobar. There it is. All of my devices have a Courage Wolf, in case you're wondering. And all I did was generate an Xcode project there. I find, so the running joke we have right now at Adobe is Xcode is exactly like Eclipse. It just looks like iTunes. So, super true. Oh no. This is hilarious. When it's in full screen mode, I can't see the left part of my Xcode, but that's okay. I'll just drag this useless crap over there. So, when we generate a project in PhoneGap, every different PhoneGap implementation shares one detail, and that's that they all have a www folder. When we first started the project, we thought we'd be cool and be like Apache and have a www folder, and what's kind of interesting is we now are an Apache project, so I guess that worked out. And if I look inside of this www folder, it's just web assets. There's nothing special going on here. There's 2 sort of bits to it. There's web assets, and then there's Cordova.js. Cordova is the open source project. And so in here, in this index.html, I have this horrible chunk of markup. And it calls some JavaScript at the bottom. It calls something called app initialize. And just for fun, we'll just quickly run this on an iPad simulator, which will probably be larger than the dimensions of my actual screen. Yep. That was the wrong choice. But we just built an app, which is kind of cool. I'm going to hop out of here. Yeah. I could make it an iPhone 5.1. Resimulate. There, it's a little better. That's super weird. I can't get my home button at this resolution. So this app is trivial, but this is the same process across all the different platforms, so it just sort of shows what it does. It's building a native app, but that native app is just a web view. And it's kind of like a high-powered web view. We used to joke that we pollute the global with awesome, so we add all these different device APIs, which I'll talk about in a bit. We're standards-based. This is also super important to the project philosophy. So when we created PhoneGap, we didn't want to create a PhoneGap. We wanted to write web apps. And so the backstory of the history, back in the, I guess, 2007, Steve Jobs announces the iPhone. We screamed like little girls and drove to Seattle and bought as many of them as we could. And he said, hey, we're going to build apps using web technology. And we thought that was awesome. And for some reason, the rest of the world didn't. And it's probably because they wanted device APIs, but they said they wanted native code. And Apple said, sure, you want to lock into our platform? Here's Xcode. And we were accepting of this. We'd been doing mobile development on BlackBerrys previously, and so anything was better than that. And we started checking out the Xcode kind of way of doing things. Back then they called it the iPhone SDK, now they call it the iOS SDK. And we saw that you could instantiate a web view. We're like, ooh, that's sneaky. Could we like put a web view in there and talk to native? And we actually sent some guys down to this thing called iPhone Dev Camp to figure that out. And they failed, and they weren't able to do it. And they ended up talking to an iOS engineer, an iPhone engineer from Apple. And they're like, hey, dude, is this possible in any way to get a communication channel going? And they're like, no, that's totally impossible. And they're like, unless you want to go through the URL, but that would suck. So that's what we did. And interestingly, that's what you're doing too. So it works. And it's not super fast, but it is a technique. So when we created PhoneGap, we thought that was neat, but no one else did. And then when they got back, we've got this guy named Joe Bowser on our team at Itobi. And Joe, I would describe as your like prototype UNIX hacker. He's got the beard, he sits at his desk, he drinks power drinks. And as soon as Android became available, he shipped off for one of those big brick G1 phones. And he got it, and he came to our office, and he unwrapped the box, and he's holding it up, and he's like, this is it. This is Android. And we're all like, that's it. Like, iPhone had already come out at this point. It was a resistive touch screen. It weighed like 3 pounds. It was a joke. So he took our PhoneGap thing for iOS and he ported it to Android. And we're like, no one cares about Android, dude. Which we were super wrong about. And then another guy on our team did it for BlackBerry. And then we realized, wait a second, this thing runs on 3 platforms. That's kind of cool. And we told other people about it and they were like, whatever, that's not cool. So we started to implement APIs because we wanted the web browser to do stuff that the native apps could do. And I think our first one was the vibration API, so there's a bunch of jokes I could say there, but I'm not going to. We did geolocation actually before anyone did geolocation, but it was a working spec. And actually Ben and Dion were the first people that kind of proposed this idea back in Google Gears days, if anyone remembers that. That's kind of what inspired us. But we knew we didn't want to build apps that were for PhoneGap. We wanted to build apps that would be portable back to the web browser once it implemented these standards. And we still hold this philosophy today. So any of the APIs we implement are based on emergent standards. We're Apache licensed, and we're accidentally a really good extensibility layer too. So this is also interesting, which I'll talk more about. Oh yeah, I added this bullet point. We're an amazing community. So PhoneGap platform. Lately, I've been calling it like a developer ecosystem, and it's got 3 components. So there's an open source project called Apache Cordova. When we joined Adobe, we donated the source code of PhoneGap back to the Apache Software Foundation. Our CLA, which is a contributor license agreement, that's the thing that you would sign if you want to contribute code. Well, we had a 3-year heritage of people contributing code to Itobi, and we were pretty sure they wouldn't have been super stoked if that had then started naming Adobe. So we knew that we wanted to pass that on to the Apache Software Foundation for stewardship because that's what our community would want. So Adobe PhoneGap is the distribution of Apache Cordova. They're, for all intents and purposes, the exact same thing. Think WebKit, Safari. And then PhoneGap Build is a cloud compiler. I don't think this is useful to you guys, but it's kind of a fun story and a bit instructive in its own way. So when we built PhoneGap, we started to do trainings. And we trained people on how to build apps using PhoneGap. But the problem we ran into is that we'd get a room of 30 people, and they'd all have different machines, they'd all have different phones and configurations, and we'd want to set them up and get them running and building applications, but we'd end up downloading the iPhone SDK and playing with provisioning profiles and just screwing around all day with getting their machine set up and never actually building an app. And so one weekend, I built the first prototype of PhoneGap Build, and we stopped setting people up, and we just started building apps using this web service. So this service runs PhoneGap on a whole bunch of servers. You post HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We send you binaries. That's how that works. And so this is a part of Adobe's Creative Cloud, and this would be the revenue angle. I don't think you care about that part, though. I think you probably care mostly about Apache Cordova, so that's our open source bits. And we recently graduated the Apache Software Foundation to a top-level project, which means we get a cool new URL and everything else stays the same. Yeah, if you want to contribute to PhoneGap, this is the place you go. And we have this awesome Japanese dude, Yohei, who draws robots for fun. If you're ever wondering where all the robots come from in our stuff. So, if we wanted to be precious about PhoneGap, we'd say it's a mobile operating system compatibility and extensibility layer. But I'd rather just characterize it by what it is, and that's just kind of like a really ugly problem. And so you've got all these different platforms with all these different languages and all these different SDKs. It's not that bad, actually. All you need to do is learn 8 programming languages, have 8 SDKs, have roughly 5 to 10K devices, and 2 operating systems, and you're good to go. That's the native reality. So management doesn't like that. The problem's not getting better. We thought we'd see consolidation by now. Like back when we first started creating PhoneGap, we were certain that we would have seen some level of consolidation today. And I think if you ask common convention knowledge here in Silicon Valley is that it indeed is consolidating, and that's totally untrue. We're just at the beginning. We don't have any clue what's going to happen. Some of the solutions here is responsive web design. I think it is a great way to view your design philosophy. The implementation of responsive design isn't quite there yet. We have to use things like CSS media queries, but that means we have to download all the CSS. There's a ton of polyfills out there, but this stuff is really just starting to get baked. Another angle of this is I think it's impossible to predict where the markets are going to move. We don't really know what's going to happen in the future. If I had been following common knowledge right now, I'd only be working on PhoneGap for iOS and Android. That makes sense. That would cover over 90% of the market. If I had followed that same logic back in 2008, we would have been putting all of our ducks in BlackBerry and Windows Phone. And, well, that would have been the wrong strategy at that time for the PhoneGap project. So the one thing that we know for sure is that we have no idea what's going on. These numbers are a little bit out of date. I think 2012 we can safely say was an Android year again. This is just purely for your information. This has nothing to do with PhoneGap. But we're noticing this move to web operating systems. So Tizen's this thing with Samsung and Intel that's essentially a WebKit on a Linux kernel. We're not going to talk about WebOS because that makes me sad. We can talk about Firefox OS, though, which makes me really excited, which is Gecko on a Linux kernel. Firefox OS is pretty fast. It boots faster now than Android. But none of you are going to see a Firefox OS device because they're going to ship in emerging markets. Very much like Windows 8 is doing, Mozilla is aware that they're probably not going to get the Western world. And they can also see that the next billion people that are going to use smartphones are going to be in Brazil, India, China, Russia, Malaysia, Singapore, those places. So they're starting there, which is interesting. So don't count Firefox out just yet. WebOS is a European Union-funded effort. I don't know if it's anything more than a bunch of PDFs right now. And another way to look at this is Chrome OS and Windows 8 are also web-based operating systems. So I guess the good news is if you write JavaScript, you're going to have a job for a while. So back to PhoneGap. Today we support these platforms as what we call core platforms, including WebOS. We actually have an HP committer who's keeping on top of that. We have what we're calling wHorizon platforms. We are actually already shipping at Apache, but not in the main distribution. So Tizen's implemented, Firefox OS we have a shim, and we're working with the Mozilla guys. Windows 7 we've already added to the core platform. Windows 8 is coming in our next release, and Windows Phone 8 as well. Nokia Qt is another interesting one. That one used to be worked on a lot by Nokia. I guess it's no longer Nokia Qt, it's Digia. I should fix that.
That's actually the foundation for Netflix.
Yeah.
Except for Wii, more or less ski out, but Wii.
Yeah. Well, you know who else is using it now is Ubuntu, interestingly. So it's found a new rebirth over in Canonical. And we've been talking with them because they want to get running on all these different new tablets as well. So this project's still got some legs in a big way. So back to the original issue, we have many operating systems, all these SDKs, many devices, more stuff coming, no clear winners or consolidation, so your best path is probably to use internet technology. That would be what makes sense. This slide is ancient. We add it to almost every PhoneGap presentation. It's our mini meme, and we love it because you'll notice there's a greater than sign on this tank, which is awesome. So the web solved all this stuff. A long time ago, every time someone brings up a native versus web debate, you'll see a guy post on a blog that cross-platform never worked. And he's posting that on a blog on the internet from any device in the world at any time he wants. With no sense of irony. No such thing as cross-platform. What? Okay, so it solves these problems, but the web comes with quite a few of its own problems. Web is sandbox, which is good. But it also means that we're a second-class citizen on the device we're running on. The web currently has a really bad offline story. If you get a chance, has anyone here seen Jake Archibald's App Cache talk? Oh, so it's in the JSConf talks. The title is, his thesis is that the App Cache is a douchebag, and it's an awesome talk. It's really funny to watch. It'll make you sad, though, if you use App Cache. Another angle of all this is we can't participate in App Store revenue and distribution. I don't think revenue matters. I'm pretty sure that a buck an app is not a sustainable business model, but we have seen a lot of reasons that you do want discovery in the App Store and you want to have the availability of an app offline. So App Stores are a thing. Device APIs are the real thing, and the web has poor tooling is another thing. And I guess this is where PhoneGap fits in. So the term hybrid development, I fought it for a long time, but it's now a thing. And it does suit. So it combines the strengths of the web and native. We're the first people to do this. Lots of people are doing this now on their own. It's actually not that hard, and I'm going to show you how we work. And you get all the benefits of the web without all these limitations. After joining Adobe, it became really apparent to me that I had to start talking about what we're not going to do and what we aren't. So we're not an IDE. The thing about Dreamweaver is a joke. We're not a language. We're not going to do a compile to. We had people talking like, oh, you guys should write your own JavaScript that generates a PhoneGap app. That's not going to happen. We're not proprietary, and we're not a runtime. And this next slide's dumb because that's what I just said. So let's keep going. So PhoneGap's a distribution of Apache Cordova. This one's also a little bit tricky for people. So when we donated the source code to Apache for a bunch of reasons. The Apache Software Foundation gives us a legal sort of neutral territory for a lot of companies to contribute. When we were in Adobe software, it was easy to find committers and contributors. It was just a GitHub type model. But when we became Adobe, it wasn't very likely that we'd see committership coming from other large organizations, especially ones that created operating systems that we were targeting. Under Apache, there's patentability clauses inside their CLAs. This is a friendly ground to the enterprise, and it was very strategic for us to move there. Right now, there's no difference between PhoneGap and Apache Cordova. If you download Cordova, it's the exact same thing. We do plan to change that down the road, where we're going to have fallback to our cloud SDK. So PhoneGap build right now is useful because you can build a Windows Phone app without having to own a Windows machine. And likewise, you can build an iOS app without having to own a Mac. So the fallback would be for that use case specifically. And PhoneGap build is free for open source and free for private use, so it's not like you'd have to ever pay. It's just what we'll do. Either way, it's all open source code. So that last line that you can't see said, think of PhoneGap as WebKit is to Safari, or Cordova to PhoneGap as WebKit to Safari. Same thing. And so since joining Apache, a lot of companies have come on board. We used to beg, borrow, and steal to try and talk to these companies, but after becoming a member of Adobe and Apache, we had a ton of corporate support. So Adobe has 23 developers working on PhoneGap full-time. IBM has 6. Microsoft has 2 to 3, depending on how you look at it. RIM has 6 developers. Nokia has 2. Intel has 2 or 3, depending on how you look at it. And Google now has 4 developers committing back to PhoneGap. So there's a lot of corporate support. Sometimes people ask me, is PhoneGap enterprise ready? And I just show them this slide. It's like as enterprise as it gets. And each of these different groups of people are somewhat responsible for their own platform. So Microsoft maintains the Windows implementations, and RIM maintains the BlackBerry implementations. Not that I think anyone here cares, but do we have any BlackBerry users in the house? Just one sad Canadian up here. All right.
BlackBerry's coming back.
I hope so, man. I hope so much. BlackBerry 10's cool, but we'll let the market figure that out. So we track a whole bunch of different groups of the W3C. When we started PhoneGap, there was no device API working group. There was the widget group, and we thought they were kind of cool, and they were onto something, but they're sort of like black sheep. And we were tracking different things that the HTML5 groups were working on. Eventually, the W3C created something called the Device API Working Group, and that's the surface that we mostly target. Recently, there's a new group called the SysApps Working Group, and that's going to address a whole bunch of other issues that I'll talk about in a bit. We've got a pretty strong philosophy in our team. We believe simple's better, and when in doubt, to use brute force. So we'll build something 3 or 4 times and throw away 6 times. Like we keep building solutions until we find one that sticks, as opposed to architecting up front. This has been probably a big core subject of debate, because we'll see there's other people that do similar things to PhoneGap, and they'll have their sort of like ivory tower on how they've built things. We've tried everything, and we've arrived at the solutions we've arrived at by trial and error. We believe web solves cross-platform. That one is still up for debate for some reason. And we believe free open source software is the best model. So simple is better is a little deceptive, because I'm going to show you some of the code we actually use. If you want to go back to your manager and sound like you were doing something computer sciencey, you can say that you were talking about the PhoneGap foreign function interface, which is what it is. It's an IPC call. But we just call it the bridge or the hack, because that's really what it is. And in iOS, we use the URL. We still do today. So it's a blunt method. We have our own protocol handler in iOS. If you're familiar with it, there's something called NS protocol URL or something. NS URL protocol. We trap every call to gap://. We parse it. We do some stuff in native, and then we call back a callback ID with some JSON on the other side back in the web view. This is the bridge. Last year we were getting 300 operations per second. This year now we're getting 500 to 600 operations a second. That's kind of slow, realistically. But then when you think about it, do you really need your geolocation 600 times a second? Probably not. So it's not that slow. It's just slow if you wanted to like render games or something. Bummer that got cut off. So PhoneGap has 2 project goals. I used to get in shit for saying these. Let me see if I can fix this really quickly. It'll make more sense. Whoa. Almost. So our first goal is the web as a first-class platform. We kind of find the web view as a second-class citizen. It doesn't get access to device APIs. It doesn't get all the good tools. It's sandboxed, all that stuff. So that's one problem we're trying to solve in PhoneGap. Our second problem is a little bit bigger, is that we don't want the project to have to exist. And this has been a part of our sort of development philosophy along the way. You can see why people would say you shouldn't say that. We believe that the web is the right way to build this stuff. We just don't believe the web's there yet. So we want to be a reference implementation for web browsers at the W3C. And that's happening. It's working. So yeah. We think PhoneGap's great today as a solution to some problems, but we didn't create it so that you would be writing PhoneGap apps. We created it so that hopefully we can get back to writing web apps. PhoneGap's free software. You get that. So device APIs. When we first created PhoneGap, we did what you'd think you'd do. We started to create UI elements. We were using native title bars and tab bars back in 2008. And we were trying to do the same thing in Android and BlackBerry, and we realized that those metaphors break down really quickly. You can't write an app that's truly cross-platform that makes use of native components without creating some leaky abstractions. And that's not the kind of... We didn't want to be a lowest common denominator across these things. And then we realized that there's some pretty great things inside of WebKit, which most of these platforms have. And you can build really compelling user interfaces with some effort if you're a web developer. But we didn't have access to were the sensors and the data on the phone. And then we had the epiphany that, hey, those things are actually cross-platform. Most phones tend to have a camera or a GPS. So we split them up into sensors and data. Sensors are camera, accelerometer, magnetometer, GPS. These are your sensors that most computers don't have, but most phones do. And then data is file system, your media, so your pictures and your movies, and your contacts and your music. Interestingly, lately there's been some discussion at W3C and other places whether or not we still need a file system today. I'm not here with answers. That's just something to think about. Do you need a file system or do you need a higher level thing? I don't know what the answer is to that. It's usually IndexedDB guys that think that too, so they're on dodgy ground. Most of us are Unix geeks, so we advocate freedom of choice, and this comes into how we build PhoneGap itself. When you use PhoneGap, you don't have to opt into this whole big ivory tower gleaming architecture you have to build for everything. If you want to just build an Android app, you can do that. If you want to just build for iOS and BlackBerry, you can do that. You can just use our command line tooling. You don't have to opt into the whole thing. You can pick and choose and compose your own stack out of our software. There's two other bullets here that are going to be completely cut off, but the next one I believe says that this extends into how apps get built. So we don't dictate how you build your app. It's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you want to use that, cool. If you want to use things like Sencha or jQuery or whatever, you can use those too. We don't dictate a tooling choice on the front end because a lot of developers have built up their preferences and their time. Some people like Dojo. And the only thing I think we all have in common is that the other guy's wrong. And we're not interested in picking that fight. We're going to give you a high-powered web view with some decent tooling across platforms, and you can figure out how to write your own application probably better than we can. And that extends further on into things like tooling support. So we don't dictate an IDE or a particular text editor. We've all probably been down that path where you were told you had to use a certain type of tool, and this is just text. It's web development. It's not hard. So we don't dictate GUI development or tooling choices. So PhoneGap's got this pretty extensive API, and you can take a look at it, docs.phonegap.com, and you can see that we cover things like accelerometer, camera, contacts, basically anything the phone can do, so can PhoneGap. And we never documented how we did what we did, because we just never got around to it. And unfortunately, our community figured it out before we were ready to tell them. And they started to create plugins. And this happened completely organically, and then we kind of wrestled some control by adding it to our GitHub. And so this would be our sort of central repository for plugins. This is going to change in the not-too-distant future. So let's go take a look at iOS for fun. There's a lot of stuff you might want the PhoneGap web view to do, but it doesn't make sense for us to do it. And so an example of that might be, let's see something good. Well, that's a good one. So Facebook would love it if we built Facebook Connect into PhoneGap, but we're not going to do that. But a lot of developers do want that functionality. Or the other one would be like in-app purchase managers, are actually a really good one, because that's really only specific to iOS. And so the community started to create all these plugins, and we started to collate them over here in this repo. And just to give you a sense of how simple this is, a plugin is going to be native code in JavaScript. And the native code implementation is, going to be a native object, whatever. And then the JavaScript side will make use of our bridge, which essentially is this thing called PhoneGap.exec. Here it is right here. And PhoneGap.exec is, the arguments are actually different. This is an older implementation. You can see we had some renaming fun go on here. The PhoneGap.exec is the magic, or Cordova.exec. And authoring a plugin is now actually documented and supported. And so I guess what the point of this is, for me to say, is that there's not anything you can't do with PhoneGap that you can do with native code. These things are not mutually exclusive. You can just write a plugin for whatever you wanted to do. Sometimes that FUD is that PhoneGap, you're limited. So all these people are building plugins now, and we're working on giving them better tools to do that. It would be uncool of me to come talk to you about my awesome open source software project without sharing with you the pain and fail that you will deal with when you get there. So, who here's been a Rails developer? Come on. So, to me, there's sort of three major pain points when you're authoring a PhoneGap application. There's the web versus native debate. There's device browser variance, and the web dev is hard. So web versus native debate, as soon as you become a person using PhoneGap, somebody's going to bring this up with you. And then you can tell them all about plugins, and they can go away. It's a bit trollish of me to bring that up that way, I know, but It's true. There really is no difference. When someone brings up this web versus native thing, they probably haven't read web browser code. It's all C, and so is your operating system. So something I like to try and pass on to people is if the web doesn't do something, it's not because it can't. It's just because we haven't gotten there yet. It's the only reason. Now that said, the real problem with PhoneGap is device browser parity. So when you're building a PhoneGap application, we use the onboard browser instance, which means that when you're building a PhoneGap app for Android, you're using the Android browser. If you're building it for iOS, you're using the mobile Safari browser. And there's differences between these different browsers, and sometimes they can be annoying. Performance, notably, in Android is worse overall compared to iOS. The kind of smart solution to this would be that we'd compile our own browser, and we're actually doing this now in Android. But you still get a huge payload. I think we've got our Chromium build on Android 4 down to 17 megs right now, which is great. We're hoping to backport that to Android 2.3 so that we can bring sanity back to the Android platform, but that work just started. And it comes with a penalty of 25 megs, which means you may not be able to download it over a slower connection, which might not be acceptable. And then the real elephant in the room is Windows 8, Windows Phone 8. Windows Phone 7.5 ships with IE9, Windows Phone 8 ships with IE10. IE10 is a pretty good browser. IE9 is missing some things like local storage, which we polyfill. Neither of them support touch events. And so, I guess the moral of the story is this is web development, and web development's hard. So that's why I drink. That's basically it. You get back to web development, and that's kind of been our goal anyways. We want people to write web apps. We don't want people to write PhoneGap apps. So I already showed you build.phonegap.com. Has anybody here seen Winery before? A few people have seen it. Not everybody has seen it, so this is just plain fun. Whoops. I don't know why I went there. So Winery is a tool that's in the PhoneGap suite of things that we do. Early on, it became obvious that debugging is pretty tough on mobile. We had no way of looking inside of that web view running on the phone, so we'd console log stuff, and it was horrible. Actually, originally we alerted stuff. This crazy hacker from IBM called Pat Mueller created this thing called Winery, and we started calling it Wiener, and that really made him upset. But he did call us, and we started working together on it. So Winery stands for Web Inspector Remote, and we really got to get a designer to help out Pat. So what he did is he took Chrome DevTools, or WebKit Inspector. So don't mind the command line magic. I just copied this script tag, which should be HTML5 friendly and not have quotes, but whatever. I'm going to paste that into an index file on my desktop that I'm going to create, and then I'm going to edit it. And then I'm going to add some dodgy markup for fun. Whatever, it's good enough. So I have an iOS emulator right here. I'm just going to kill you. Might have built a few PhoneGap apps in the past. This is going to be kind of non-fun, but we'll do it. Oh, wow. Okay. Don't worry, this will be rad when it actually all happens. So I'm going to go to this. Oh, not that. I'm going to go to this client. This might look familiar because that's basically WebKit Inspector. So now this device over here could be any old device in the world. It could be on, as long as it's on the same network. We've just created a socket connection. So now I can just use my WebKit Inspector instead of Chrome, remoting into any device. Crazy enough, the guys from Microsoft have helped us port this to Windows 8. So you can remote inspect inside of Windows 8 and all the way back to iOS, whatever. I think we started doing this in 3.0, and everything kind of works. This isn't a big deal if you're a developer working in the browser. This is a huge deal if you're a mobile developer working against a phone. And so Winery is just a damn cool tool. So know that you have that available to you. Not as big of a deal now because in iOS 6, Apple introduced remote debugging. You have Chrome remote debugging, which is not the same as debugging the Android browser, but you do have Chrome remote debugging in Android. BlackBerry has had this forever. No one cared. Yeah, so I don't know. Remote debugging, it's a thing, and you can do it now, which is kind of great. Where did my slides go? They're there. So we host our own version of that called debug.phonegap.com if you ever want to go do that. But one sort of word to the wise, everybody copies and pastes this, and then that means that if they go here, if there's anybody in the world using this, which likely there is, right now I'm connecting to their phone. Is someone in there? No one's in there. Last time I checked this and I was demoing, there was like 5 people in there, and I just did a couple of, what's up, mate? And that, got sent to devices somewhere on the internet, which is, so, if you're looking for something to do, that'd freak people out. But, if you want to use this tool, I recommend changing that part, and you can enter something here. So that's our hosted version of that tool. Pretty funny. All right. We have support. Cool. So I heard a really rad statement the other day at the Apache Software Foundation. Like, you start off, you build this project, and you think it's all about the code, but it's not. It's actually all about recruiting. I think this is super true about any project, but especially so an open source project. And so I had this slide up at a bank, and I'm like, we really want to get people contributing. And they laughed at me. And I'm like, man, like, filing a bug is actually contributing. If we don't know about a phone breaking, then that helps us. So there's lots of ways to get involved. If there's something that's interesting to you here, talk to me after, because we do need more contributors all the time. We don't own all the phones. So we have a weird release philosophy. I'm going to tell you like a funny story. So we built PhoneGap, we shipped it, and everything was cool. 2008, we tagged 0.8.0. And I shit you not, we stayed on that tag for almost an entire year. And people would log bugs, and they'd be like, this thing is broken, whatever. And I'd be like, oh, man, I can't reproduce that. I mean, what version are you? Oh, shit. Are you on Edge? So then we just tell people to work off Edge all the time. And our issue tracking was a nightmare. IBM joined the project in 2009, and they're like, you guys are nuts. We got to move to fast releases. And we took that almost too literally. So now we release once a month. For a period of time, we were releasing every 2 weeks. And this was great. We decoupled version numbers from features. We realized that you could just cut a version at any time, and it didn't matter, because version numbers, their only purpose, the only reason you have a version number is for issue tracking. That's it. It's not for marketing. It's not for anything else. It's just for issue tracking. And so the more of those you have, the more fidelity you have, the easier it is to track down bugs, the easier it is to ship fixes. So we do major minor patch. We generally agree on a goal in a month, and we try and ship on that goal. We prioritize shipping a feature or fixing bugs over anything, and we prioritize shipping over anything else. So we just shipped 2.0. We finally agreed to what our plugin architecture is. That took a long time. It's still evolving a little bit, but if you write a plugin today, it's going to be stable for at least the foreseeable future. We added the CLI tooling that I showed you earlier for creating projects and kicking up emulators and loggers and that kind of thing. We added Windows Phone, the help of Microsoft. And our least known feature, which I'm ashamed of because it's super important, is Cordova View. So the idea here is that you can embed, right now you can embed web browsers and native apps, but you couldn't embed PhoneGap into native apps, but now you can. So Cordova View is basically an instance of the PhoneGap web browser that you can embed in any native project. And there's a couple of use cases for this. We saw people like Twitter and Facebook were implementing hybrid apps where the top navigation bar and the bottom bar were native code, but the middle part, that was web code. And then they were creating their own sort of sketchy bridge technology, and it was just like fail. And they would come to us and talk to us about bugs. So we implemented Cordova View so they could just implement embedding PhoneGap. Interestingly, we're seeing less uses of it in that regard and more uses of people that want to migrate off of a native app into the web. And so they'll embed a Cordova View, and then they'll just switch their view slowly over to web code, and it gives them a migration out. I guess it could give you a migration in as well. Here's a bunch of links, whatever. You can look at the slides later. So this part, I'm going to just go through our roadmap for, I guess, 2013, because we're almost done 2012. This is like the cheesy I'm at work slide. But then someone said, PhoneGap's like the Herman Miller chair of mobile development. I thought that was awesome. This term developer ergonomics is really popular right now, but I think it's with good reason. Our workflows are like clunky. Our processes are decoupled from our tools, and it doesn't work. So the first one we noticed was command line tooling on these different mobile platforms is drastically different, but they all do the same thing. You build, you emulate, you release, you log. They all do that. Why was the nomenclature different? Whatever. So we unified that. Winery I showed you for debugging. And there's another tool from RIM called Ripple, which, cool, you know about it. That's awesome. Not a lot of people know about it, but it's basically an emulator that runs inside of Chrome. And currently, it runs as a Chrome extension. And it gives you a fake version of PhoneGap running in the browser. We actually just finished a hack weekend with the guys that wrote Ripple up in Whistler. And we actually wrote code on top of some skiing and possibly drinking to change that. So I'll talk about the changes to Ripple in a second. Our plugin API is documented. But right now, I just showed you our plugin repo. Where is it? I want to find a really bad example for you. That isn't it. Oh, this one's good. So the child browser is probably the most adopted plugin for all the PhoneGap plugins, and it's also the worst named plugin for obvious reasons. We won't get into that. So when you install a plugin right now, actually it's not there. Let me find a better example. Sometimes if I just pick one at random, I can find one that's terrible. Let's see, maybe Google Analytics is bad.
Click on the PayPal one.
Is that one bad?
I don't know.
Yeah, let's find out.
Calling it out.
PayPal plugin, let's see. Oh, well, here it is. Oh, Shaz works on that. That's great. Yeah, this one's pretty bad. Okay, so not based on code, based on possibility for failure. So if we look at this, there's a 6 manual step process to add a plugin to your project, right? There's plenty of opportunity for human error, which we know is probably the best surface for it. And let's see, what's it do? So make sure you got a version number, make sure you have a folder, add these files here, copy this file there. This is shit for a computer. This isn't stuff people do. So we have this plugin API. In order for us to copy stuff around consistently, we need a consistent package format. And we've been arguing about this one for about a year. We finally have just started to arrive on no matter what we argue about, we're going to hate it. So we've decided to pick the one we hate the least, so that we'll hate that one the least maybe later on. It's going to change, I'm certain of it, but that's okay because that's what version numbers are for. So plugin packaging means that we then get automated installation, which would be pretty nice. But it also means that we get discovery. And we've been working with the Node guys on this one. Last year, Isaac was like, no, do not use NPM for anything else. And whatever reason this year, he's like, cool, use NPM. It's like a commons. He read some socialist book or something. I don't know. So at any rate, we may use the engines attribute in package JSON to do this. We're not sure how it's going to work, but it does work today. We have plugin installation working from a GitHub repo or from NPM, which is awesome. It's going to allow us to do things like remove all the plugins from PhoneGap, so we're just a bridge, and then we can maintain our core plugins, and then you as a developer get to compose a build of PhoneGap that you choose to build. This has another benefit that if you look at like our API surface, it's a pretty big vector for attack and also for just bloat. Like, you know, your app might use the camera, but is it going to use the camera connection context device event? I mean, that's a shitty app. It's just going to do a bunch of stuff that it doesn't need to do. Most apps need 1 or 2 plugins. They don't need all of these. So it's just better overall to move to that architecture, and that we're gunning for PhoneGap 3. I mentioned earlier that we work with different standards groups. So CSS working group, we talk to them all the time. DAP we've been talking to for years. Widget Working Group, they do like a thing called config.json, which is essentially our meta file for packaging. This has been an area of debate for a lot of people. We use this thing called config.xml because we transform this into like Android manifest or the plist in iOS's case. These are all XML formats anyways. Everyone's like, oh, you should use JSON. And I tend to agree, but parsing JSON with different tools and then turning it into XML, not fun. So we're sticking with this, and it's a spec. Sysapps. Sysapps is interesting. So this is a new working group, and their basic goal is to figure out runtime security and permissions. And so if we look at the DAP APIs, which are essentially the PhoneGap APIs, where'd it go? You're here somewhere. There you are. So if we look at all these APIs, no big deal. PhoneGap gets to cheat. By cheat, I mean we get the security model of whatever platform we're running on. So in the case of iOS, we get the security of an App Store review. And in the case of Android, we get runtime security. Type checking, so when you install an app, it says, hey, this app uses all this crazy shit. And people just say yes. That's probably not a really good model for the web. And you might have noticed this, you might not have noticed this, but if you go into Chrome and you click on site information, there's this new tab called permissions. And if you look, there's a whole bunch of interesting permissions here. This is kind of the thinking behind the sysapps group at the W3C. And this is going to be the straw man from Google on it. We need a way for the ability for end users to inspect the permissions that a particular domain has. And right now, if you go to a website and it says, hey, can I access your geolocation, you blindly say yes. You may not ever know that site has access to your geolocation. Probably not a big deal. There used to be scare stories about that in the past. Now imagine that site has access to your front-facing camera and your contact list. Right, so that can get sketchy. So we need a way to inspect not only the permissions that a particular domain has, but be able to revoke them and do whatever we want with them in the future. We don't want the web as a second-class platform, but we certainly don't want to compromise the security of the web because that's its biggest strength. Sysapps is going to work on that first, and then a lot of the DAP APIs are going to be revisited with this thinking, where there's a runtime security and permissioning model. PhoneGap's role here, or the Cordova team's role, is going to be to prototype this stuff on phones and give the surface for rapidly iterating against. So the Agile release train, that's kind of the fancy way of saying that we ship every month. And we're not the only ones doing this. The Chrome team does this. The Firefox team does this. Damn you, Siri. Chrome team does this. Linux does this. Everybody's doing this these days. So the idea is that we prioritize fixing bugs. And the only thing that takes priority over fixing bugs is shipping every month. Work on feature branches. That means we know when we're going to ship. Funny enough, we still haven't shipped 2.3, but that's okay because December was a Unicode snowman. And now that we're at Apache, we're on this sort of cadence where we have to do what's called a board report, which is like a community report back to the Apache Software Foundation about any possible issues with our community or maybe legal or security woe. This gives me a nice way to kind of break up our roadmap. So it's broken up by season. The autumn. We've actually, it's funny showing this presentation now because this was written before and we did it. We did a lot of this stuff, which is amazing. So 2.0 shipped, and then Apple ships Mountain Lion, and all of a sudden our issue tracker fills up with all these trolls saying, you guys suck, doesn't work on Mountain Lion. It's like, dude, release today. Like, give me an hour. So we fixed some bugs. We started working on a Firefox OS prototype. We were aiming to ship that around January, February timeframe. The phones are really cool. If you can get your hands on one, I recommend checking it out. Imagine Android, but a little bit faster boot up. Google's helped us make Cordova Android and Cordova iOS faster. It's like roughly 500 ops a second. So Ripple, that emulator thing I was talking about, there was talk about including that as a sub-project. Then RIM decided they wanted to be a top-level project. So now they're a top-level project, and they're a dependency of ours at Apache, whatever its politics. Config.xml, that thing from the widget group, that got out of sync. And I actually still don't know why it got out of sync, but it got out of sync across platforms, open source, yay. It's now back in sync. Everybody was using Child Browser. Nobody liked the name, so we renamed it to In-App Browser, and now we're including it inside of PhoneGap as a part of it. So the main use case here, you build like a Twitter client or something, you click a link. If you're in iOS, it kicks you out to the browser. You're no longer in the app experience. It's a bad experience. This really isn't a problem on other platforms, but it's definitely a problem in iOS. You want to keep them in the app, and so you have an in-app browser instance. That's the idea. We fought heavily about this one, about the API. It was tricky. We were like, what could you have for the API be? Where is... hold on. Let me go to Edge. Then we're like, wait a second, web browsers are great at opening web browsers. So we just polyfilled window.open. So that API is really trivial to use. Spawning browsers is super simple now. And you can listen to things like loading events, which we're going to propose back to the W3C at some point. And a declarative API. So you can do an anchor tag with a target equals blank, and that'll spawn an in-app browser as opposed to a browser that's out of context. We have this thing called the master script, which is kind of like the master sword from Zelda. We have a lot of Zelda fans. And the idea is, that's hard to read. The idea is a command line tool that wraps all of the command line tools on a per platform basis. This stuff is probably broken. Let's see, what version am I at? Oops. Yeah, it's pretty early. Let's see. So this is a node module as well. And this will probably become the primary way that we distribute PhoneGap and Apache Cordova eventually. And basically this is a vendored version of the current release of PhoneGap, and it gives you access to all of our command line tools by shelling into those native platforms. This is how we're going to do the fallbacks to PhoneGap build eventually. This might take a minute to install, so we'll get back to it. So we're working with the Node community on this one, especially for the plugin stuff. So the idea in PhoneGap 3 and Cordova 3 is that there's no API surface. It's just a bridge, and it's embeddable. And then you get to choose which APIs that you want to use. So wintertime, we just added this command line tool to NPM a little while ago. It just landed in Apache. I'm guessing we're another 3 or 4 months of hardening before this is going to be like something you want to use in your day-to-day, but it's worth checking out. Once this is ready, though, we're going to start ripping our own plugin APIs out, and that means that you can do things like Cordova install geolocation, Cordova install in-app browser, whatever. So Ripple, that thing I was talking about, that emulator. This past weekend, we added what we call device proxying, and so if you're using Ripple right now, you get this kind of annoying set of panels, and if you want to move, say, the accelerometer, you have to move this sort of 3D plane thing. If you were building a game, you don't want to move some weird 3D box. You want to play with your phone and see if it's actually working. But you don't want to wait for your app to compile to your phone and pick up your phone and start playing and realize there's a bug, and you're like, ah, shit, and you go back and write some code, and then you compile. That's not how we want to work. We want to work in our browser, but we still want to have the surface of our devices. So Ripple now is going to come with a set of PhoneGap apps that you install on a device. You're going to kick up a little socket server locally, and anything that happens on the device will get proxied into the web browser on your computer. So if you take a picture here, you'll get the bits for that picture on here in your browser, which means you can do all your development completely in browser, but you still get all the realistic data from your phone. That prototype is just landed on Apache. We hope to be shipping this stuff sometime in the next couple months, more hardened and tested. Right now, the prototype only works on iOS, Android, and BlackBerry, so we have to have Windows Phone support too. That's pretty cool. The other thing that we're adding is the ability to add Ripple as middleware. So to inject Ripple into a website before it fully loads. This might be useful if you want to see if your mobile web app is actually working. You could turn it on as Connect middleware. That also should be shipping around the same time. I went to Zynga and I asked them what we could do, and they were, first thing they said is HTML5 audio is fucked. And so just for them, I added unfuck HTML5 audio. There's a lot of problems with it. We've just started investigating this. We expect to ship this again sometime near the end of winter. The first thing is fix the audio tag. Second thing is no latency. Right now, if you start a song or a sound, it takes there's a delay, which if you're building a game is not cool. And in some phones you can't do more than one track, which is also not cool. We may go so far as to start bike shedding out all of Google's madness, where you can do bit shifting and all that other crazy shit. I don't know if we're going to do all that, but we're definitely going to fix the audio tag. And then kind of on that note, once we start removing all of our own plugins with our own tools, we're going to want to start auditing them and versioning them independently of PhoneGap, or of Cordova's releases. So a good example of this, are you guys familiar with the Media Capture API? So that's a get user media or whatever. We actually implemented that first, and you can see a really early version of it. Whoops. Wow. Right now it's loading the mobile version of our docs, which is funny. So the original, I'm not kidding you, this was the original implementation or the original proposed spec for media capture. So it would have been capture audio and capture video somewhere down here. Capture image. Anyways, this API has been revved a bunch of times and is landing in browsers, so we need to update ours. We're out of sync. So we wanted to get our plugin tooling done so that we could do this independently, so we don't break people that are on older versions of PhoneGap. They can choose and compose the version of plugin that they need. But then there's a whole host of people that just want to be on the latest bleeding edge stuff, and we want to accommodate that too. We had a goal to graduate from incubation at Apache. Apache has this weird sort of ceremony that you have to be incubated before you can become a top-level project. We've already graduated. In the spring, we imagine we're still going to be auditing our APIs. And actually, I should show you this too. If you go to wiki.cordova.io, you can see all of the things that we're up to. And so if you want to see like a more unfiltered view of our roadmap, you can look at that. But our core API audit, if it says deprecated, that means that we're going to be revving the version on it. So there's a few. I expect it's going to take us a little while to do. Some of these are not too bad. There's like, geolocation, that's pretty solid. Media's got to change. Checkout notification is going to be a big one. Really big. This is actually underway by Google, and we're probably going to get rid of SQLite storage because people just aren't really using it anymore. We imagine by this time we're going to start also experimenting with runtime security stuff. I don't know how much. We're going to see. There's a lot of proposals out there. Another big, every single app now needs push notifications. It's not even a question, and so that should be a part of our platform. Urban Airship actually developed the first plugin, and from our survey, and it seems that everybody uses Urban Airship, so we may sensibly default to Urban Airship. That doesn't mean that you can't use your own push notification servers or anything like that, but we're probably going to use this plugin. Google's gone pretty far with this, so this huge document right here is the implementation they're working on. We actually have a notification namespace currently, which is where we put things like vibrate and beep, and those don't belong there anymore. So we're going to deprecate that, but then we're going to turn push notifications, our namespace, into things like local notifications, status bar, push notifications. We're going to match the W3C APIs, and we're probably going to default to using Urban Airship's infrastructure, at least as a start. But again, you can pick and choose your own servers. This guy, Simon McDonald, who has the thickest Eastern Canadian accent I have ever heard in my life, implemented file contacts native picker. So on my phone, if I use the contacts API, it works really fast because I have 28 contacts. But on most people's phones, it's really slow because they have hundreds of contacts. And it has to paginate it and put it into memory. It's just dumb because really what you want is input type equals contact. And that should invoke a native picker, and you should grab that contact. So we're going to add that functionality and propose it. I think I gave this talk to some contributors at some point. Again, our goals are really not for you to be writing PhoneGap apps. And so that's kind of the main thing I want to stress back to people. If it can be a web app, it probably should be. Only use PhoneGap if you really think you need to use it. And that's about it for this part of the presentation anyway.